So we have now some specific questions about key concept of your work, and the first one is dwelling. In your text, being on holiday, tourism dwelling, bodies and places and place, published in Tourism Studies in 2003, you defend a dwelling perspective on tourism, and you say that doing tourism is not only a matter of being in space or representing the space, it is a matter of practicing space and practicing through space. And you are crossing and linking two main theoretical lines, Heideggerian metaphor of dwelling and Deleuzian philosophy that helps to consider the tourism as a subject and situated in a complex geographical networks and material assemblage. And it's a very powerful and stimulated research agenda. It was published in 2003, and so you make your fieldwork after. And my first question, how about the use of the expression of metaphor in your text? Is there a contradiction with the cultural geography approach and the very concrete and tangible concept of practices you use, as explored, for example, by Michel de Certeau?
This is an article I'm more proud of, and I always say that my career started well and then it went downhill because I've never managed to do anything remotely as interesting as that. That's the first thing I ever wrote for an academic journal, and it's basically the theory chapter of my PhD. I thought the concept of dwelling comes here from anthropology precisely, and I imagine that's one of the reasons why you are interested in that, because it comes from Tim Ingold. And I really like what I really like from Tim Ingold is this notion of you cannot take the thoughts out of how it's. Let me remember the exact expression now, because the place is the homeland of your thoughts. So you cannot really detach. He denies the notion of detachment and therefore the notion of representation. And you know, all our thoughts comes from somewhere, and we are always. Especially, we are always involved with the place. We cannot be detached from place. And of course, this is contradictory totally with this notion of how tourism is seen as a sign of distant spectatorship and all that kind of things, like the distant gaze, the looking things from without involvement from afar, that kind of thing, which is how tourism is conceived. So I was very, very interested about this idea that the world is the homeland of your thoughts and of your identity. Dwelling has a big problem, and I've been criticized heavily about it, which is, of course, dwelling is a concept that presupposes being static. It's about being, it's done by Heidegger, and Heidegger, if Heidegger ever wrote that, will probably crucify me on the top of the biggest German hill in the world, because he thought of dwelling exactly in the opposite direction in some respects. It's like there's no possibility of dwelling in mobilities. Dwelling is something that's about being rooted to the place rather than something that you can acquire. You can acquire in a mobile life. But the way we dwell in the world, the way we actually get involved with places is becoming very mobile. And we need to be able to transport, I think, this notion of being involved with place, being sort of place, not just like located somewhere, but being involved with it. To a more mobile context, and that's the logic behind. Metaphor, probably I haven't thought that much about. If I probably somebody I read used the word metaphor, so I probably use that. I guess metaphor here means ways of explaining a particular conceptualizations, if you want to say that ways. I guess I like metaphor because has a certain feel of the concept being a little bit provisional and being like another tool here, and that's probably where it goes, but I'm not sure I can develop that further, really.
Well, part of your work is to do with, and you mentioned that yesterday, retrieving mass tourism from, so to speak, dustbin of history. That is, from a long history of neglect and even contempt, both inside and outside academia. We all know that there is a deep anti-democratic, elitist vein in many anti-touristic attitudes. That's for sure. And it's important to bring that up and to be aware of this. Nevertheless, having said that, people also invoke very concrete material reasons for criticizing mass tourism. In other words, what can we say to those people that are not, for instance, directly taking any pleasure or benefits out of tourism, but have to deal with crowded buses and streets in their way to work, rising prices in their residential areas, nocturnal noise, dirty streets, which they directly associate with mass tourism? I don't know if this is clear.
Yeah, I'm not defending mass tourism. I definitely not. And if I was a tourism planner, I will definitely do a lot of things to stop a lot of the issues that you mentioned. But I'm not a planner. One thing is that I haven't worked on the urban context very much. I work mostly on the coastal context, which is a very forgotten context, and actually is in a space that is actually losing ground as well, which is an interesting thing to discuss if you want. Mass tourism, coastal mass tourism. One thing that we do not understand. I like to put this. When we think of mass tourism, we think of British tourists going to Mallorca, to Magaluf, or to Ibiza, or to that kind of places that I don't recommend you, and getting really drunk and doing this kind of eating too much and all kind of things, and then getting absolutely wrecked like a lobster and go back home, right? And for us, doesn't make sense. But then, if you think through, are we not doing the same on a summer village festival that we go every summer, and we get together and we get a little bit, we do a lot of excesses. We definitely, where I'm coming from, we have lots of these festivals. But then we have these paradoxes that we get very drunk or we get partying heavily, and this is fine, but if the British tourist comes to a resort nearby to do exactly that, it's not fine. So I think we need to be more fair about our assessments, because why the white working class of Northern Europe is wrong, and we middle-class Southern Europeans are right. So I think there is a lot of ethical problems when we study that. We cannot dismiss phenomena outright because people get drunk or because people are whatever. Interestingly, there's a very interesting history behind that. Why British people come to Menorca or Mallorca? And of course it's because the weather in England is terrible. But there is another thing, which is, of course, linked with religion. Religion suppress the festival in Northern Europe. So it suppress all this notion of celebration that in Southern Europe we do have very well. But this notion of celebration did not disappear, but resurfaced in other places. So what used to be a temporal category, the 1 week a year where there's village festival and all that kind of things, become 1 week a year in another place. So here there's a very particularly important place called Blackpool. I don't know if you've ever been to Blackpool. It's a weird place. It's a very interesting but very strange place, which actually is the first place that the working classes went on holidays. And this is the context where these old ideas of breaking off, having holidays, the holy day, the saint day, resurfaces through other ways. So it's actually a lot of interesting connections around coastal mass tourism here that are worth it. I don't know if I move a bit further away from your question. I'm not sure I've answered your question very well, but oh yeah, what I would do. Right, one thing that I'm not an expert on urban tourism, therefore I cannot talk properly about things that are going on in neighborhoods like the Alfama or neighborhoods of Barcelona. There are very, very worrying trends going on right now. I think, however, there is in particular certain activists which I agree totally on their proposals. On the one hand, I agree on their proposals, I disagree on their assessment. So I agree on the control of, for example, Airbnb, but I disagree on the very notions that they are using to understand this phenomena. Because what we are having here is something much more complex. It's about globalization, it's about certain places being highly connected and others being disconnected, and actually the connected and disconnected places being very close to each other. So communities that are very localized, living next to communities which live between New York, Berlin, Barcelona, Lisbon, and they are how the globalization is increased mobility, and this is part of this increased mobility, which is to do with work, leisure, education, a bit of everything at the same time. But then there is something very interesting, and that's where I want to go. There is a changing way of doing tourism. There used to be a very clear demarcation of where to go on holidays in the past, and which is blurred. People are traveling differently, and this is a key expression to it. A lot of the things that used to happen in Magaluf are now happening in cities. Mass tourism, things that used to happen in a place that we don't see, so we can profit from it, but we don't see, are now happening in cities. In the UK, I live in Newcastle, which is famous for its statues, but as well in Barcelona, in Lisbon, and these kind of places. So there's a change in patterns there we need to understand.
To what an extent does a theory we have, a theoretical notion, can it act like, how can I say, preventing us from being critical, you know? Like, I think that this attitude towards mass tourism is anti-democratic.
Yeah, first of all, I think we have a duty as academics, regardless of our political positions, to treat tourism neither as a cash machine nor as culture dupes. Neither as just how we can make more money and how we can profit hard of it, nor who are these people who knock my door on a Saturday morning kind of thing, right? So we have a duty to, and that's the best survey we can make to any organization or any campaign, have a duty to actually understand what's going on. And I'm afraid, in particular in the case of urban tourism, in the case of neighborhoods like Alfama, what is going on, I think, is quite complex. That requires solutions, some of which are very straightforward, like to do with housing and things like that, and which I agree on it. But it's not just, for example, a discussion I keep having with hotel people in Menorca. Airbnb is not just a matter of unfair competition. There's more to it. It's about a particular, you are not looking for luxury, you are not looking for, sometimes you do, but you are not looking to get the best 5-star hotel. That's not your aim. Your aim is to get the best inside experience of the neighborhood. So there's a lot of changes here. The other thing I want to say is about the need to manage tourism democratically. Sometimes the way we manage tourism or we discuss the tourism policies is very undemocratic. Only hotels or only planners, only certain small collectives can have a voice in it. And I think if tourism is everything, everybody has a right to talk about tourism. And of course that leads to a second question, which is the right to travel. Is it right to manage Airbnb accommodations? Indeed, it's necessary. If not, neighborhoods will disappear. But can we stop the right to travel? That's a slightly more tough question. And I have my concerns with certain campaigns, in particular in Mallorca, that get too close to this notion of right to travel. How we can control excess of tourism? Because we have to, but we have to be very clear about what are the rights to travel or not.
Yeah. Still on the political dimension of tourism, I would like to speak about a text, a short text, but very interesting. It's art politics, memory, tactical tourism, and the root of anarchism in Barcelona. That was published in Cultural Geographies in 2010. And in this text, you highlight the political dimension and the emancipatory potential of tourism practices. And it's very original. This text is about a group of artists from Barcelona called Tactical Tourism. Can you tell us more about this, the activity of this group?
Yeah, that's one of those kind of things that you do that is very minor and it becomes something terribly interesting. This was a group of artists that did what's called the root of anarchism. They're trying to uncover spaces because anarchism, Barcelona has been the biggest anarchist city in the world, and what's happening now, it has to do with it, indeed. That, of course, the anarchism was crushed, defeated, Holocaust, murdered completely after the Civil War, and their histories have kind of disappeared. And so they did this route of anarchism by bus. The bus was intervened with all sorts of films and caricatures and so on, and it was a massive, massive success. And then I did organize a field trip, and I contacted them, and I managed to do the activity without the bus, but I did the activity, and it was wonderful. The students love it. For example, we finished, and it was going to see the tiny ghost of the past. For example, I don't know if you know who is Salvador Puig. Is one of the last. It was a young activist, was 21 or 22. Who just after Carrero Blanco was bombed in Madrid, he was arrested and a police kind of died in the middle. There was a very strange circumstances, and he was a member of a political group called the Mill. And anyway, he was arrested and he was condemned to death. And he was one of the last. He was the last person in Spain to be not the last to be killed, but the last to be used the famous Spanish garrote bill system. And that provoked a huge outrage around the world. And this was a defining moment of the end of a Spain dictatorship. Anyway, the whole story is that we went to the bar where he was arrested, and the cafes are served by the same woman. And then we went next door, and he pointed us towards a staircase, and you still can see the hole of that bullet. So that tiny material presence that actually provoked one of the biggest political stories of the 1970s in Spain. It's like, but what was interesting, what interested us, not so much the history, but the use of tourism in that way. Tourism as a medium of communication, in a very situationist way. He is an artist. The alma mater, he is from Chile and lived in Berlin or Amsterdam, and so he had context. He had quite connections with situationism, and he used tourism as a language, which what interests me here. It's like how tourism can tell political stories differently, how establish a relation with place differently, and how can unveil things that are there but nobody sees.
It's interesting. And you say that you, in your text, and now that situationism is a key artistic reference for this group. I would like to know more about that. And where situationist texts are a reference for you? And I mean, linking, for example, with the dwelling perspective. I think there is some point here.
Oof. Link situationism and dwelling, you mean?
Yeah.
Oof, I haven't thought about that. No. I'm trying to do something on dwelling for another avenue. I think it's forcing a little bit too much dwelling and situationism, not because the political histories of the two are very different, so I would like to be very careful about that. I think there's certainly something about the relation of people and place that there's certain echoes there. But I wouldn't like, because I think one is very static, the other is very mobile, one is very deep, the other is very much more fluid, I don't know.
And yesterday in your conference you speak about the right of the city, and I remember the text, important text of Henri Lefebvre. And did you have some?
I read Lefebvre, I haven't used it. It's one of the first texts I read when I started my PhD. And then I didn't know how to use it. So it's not an author I'm particularly familiar. I'm more familiar with ISCTE-IUL, for example, this notion of tactics and strategies. Foucault is never far away. But Lefebvre is a guy that I haven't managed to use that much. I don't know why.
And did you find or explore other examples of this kind of group in Catalonia or in Europe, or did you?
No, I haven't explored any other this group, but I'm doing. I submitted an article to Annals of Tourism Research, fingers crossed, about an invented festival in Mallorca, which is very interesting. It's a village. It's a village called Sineu, and I'm doing it with a friend of mine. This is a village that had a very boring festival, and they decided they want to have some proper festival. So invented a new festival. They took a legend, an old legend, medieval legend from the village, and they create a whole festival. And the festival is very, very interesting. It's a pilgrimage to a cave where there is a demon coming out, and there's an open of a spirit, un pregón, and then there's and then one of the interesting things of that festival is it queers the identity of the village. It's a very traditional village, and it queers. Everybody has to wear pink, so it looks like a pride event in a village of the countryside. But for example, the main event is they have what's called Mook and Muka. Mook is this original character from the legend. There's one guy that will represent Mook, and then there is the woman complained that it was only men there, so they create Muka, and they create their own version of that event, much more linked with actually queer politics, much more linked with much more irreverent, no links to tradition. So and then you have these two characters, and then they decide to make a parody of the Easter celebrations of the procession of the encounter between Jesus Christ and the Virgin Mary, and in the same place that they do in the Easter day, the parody of Jesus Christ and the parody, the encounter, they parody with Mook and Muka going there, and of course being very irreverent and a bit sexualized there. So what I'm trying to, what is the connection there? Is the use of tourism to actually transform the identity of the place, to make a completely different narrative, and actually much more progressive and much more urban and much more totally defies this notion of traditionalism and all that. So that's one thing that I'm particularly excited about this project, and hopefully it's going to be published soon if